Chapter 6. 3 years later, Tim woke to silence. Not the comfortable silence of early morning, but the heavy, oppressive silence of a house that had forgotten how to breathe. He lay in bed, a bed far too large for one person, in a room far too grand for someone who'd once slept in forest moss, and stared at the ceiling. 3 years. 3 years since the ennoblement ceremony. 3 years since he'd entered a dungeon. 3 years since he'd felt like himself. The voices were getting louder. They came from the west, from the south, from distances that should have been too far to hear. Dungeons calling to him across hundreds of miles, their voices carried on currents of magic and desperation. Coward. You left us for royalty. Wimp of a man. Death incarnate, they called you. But you're just another noble playing at power. Each insult cut deeper than the last. Each day made the weight of his title feel heavier. Duke. He was a duke. And dukes didn't crawl through dungeons covered in monster blood and ancient dust. Nobles weren't allowed to be adventurers. He'd learned that the hard way. The first month, Tim had tried to renew his adventurer's license within weeks of arriving at his duchy. He'd ridden to the nearest guild hall, a 2-day journey from his manor, and approached the counter with his identification plate still hanging around his neck. I need to renew my license, he'd said. The clerk had looked at him, looked at the duchy seal on his travel papers, looked back at him with something like pity. I'm sorry, Your Grace. Nobility cannot hold adventurer licenses. It's kingdom law. What? That's ridiculous. I'm still the same person. The law is clear. Nobility may sponsor adventurers, they may fund expeditions, but they cannot personally delve dungeons. It's considered beneath their station and dangerous to the succession. I don't have an heir. There's no succession to worry about. Nevertheless, Your Grace, the law is absolute. Tim had argued for an hour, then 2. He'd cited precedents, made appeals, offered to sign waivers absolving the guild of responsibility. None of it mattered. Nobles weren't adventurers. And Duke Timothy Willett, born in a forest with knowledge older than civilization, wasn't allowed to do the one thing he'd been created to do. The first-year marriage to Silthara had been complicated. She was kind, patient, understanding in ways that seemed impossible for someone who'd only known him a few months. She grounded him when the voices got too loud, helped him navigate the labyrinth of noble politics, taught him elven customs and protocols. But 6 months into their marriage, he discovered something that changed everything. They'd been at a diplomatic function, some tedious affair with elven ambassadors, when one of them had addressed Silthara with a title Tim didn't recognize. Fourth Princess Silthara, your presence honors us. Tim had frozen. Fourth Princess? Silthara had smiled apologetically. I was going to tell you. You're royalty? Fourth in line to the elven throne. But I'm 347 years old, Tim. I'm never going to be queen. My older sisters are all healthier, more politically connected, and significantly more interested in ruling. My father sent me here as an emissary, yes, but also to give me something meaningful to do. And marrying me was meaningful? Marrying the dungeon lord? Silthara had touched his face gently. That's the most meaningful thing I could possibly do. You matter, Tim, more than you realize. It should have been comforting. Instead, it made him feel like a political chess piece. Year 2. Tony and Sarah. The news came by messenger pigeon. Tim had been reviewing tax documents, mind-numbing work that made him want to scream, when Silthara brought him the letter. It's from the capital, she said quietly. About Count Ashfern. Tim opened it. The words blurred together at first, then sharpened into terrible clarity. Count Anthony Marcellus Ashfern died in his sleep on the morning of the 15th of autumn. Natural causes. The Countess has been informed. Funeral arrangements are being made. Natural causes. Tony was 30 years old, healthy, strong, skilled, and he died in his sleep of natural causes. Tim crumpled the letter in his fist. He'd learned the full story weeks later, pieced together from gossip and careful questions to contacts in the capital. Tony and Sarah's marriage had been difficult from the start. They'd been friends, partners. But being commanded to marry, to share a bed, to be intimate with someone you thought of as a sibling, that was a different kind of torture. They'd tried. They'd genuinely tried to make it work. But there were complications. Tony had undergone a magical examination, standard procedure for noble marriages, ensuring the line could continue. The results had been devastating. He had no internal magic, none. Not even the baseline magic log that every man who could sire magical children possessed. Count Ashfern could not produce an heir. The court had been horrified. They'd granted a count title to a man who couldn't continue his bloodline. It was unprecedented, unacceptable. Something had to change. The decree came in the second year. Countess Sarah Gellin would bear a child with Duke Timothy Willett to ensure the continuation of the Eastern Reach nobility. Tim had received that letter and immediately sent a response. Absolutely not. The court had not been pleased. Then, 3 months later, Tony had died. Sarah swore someone had killed him. The morning she'd woken beside him, he hadn't been breathing. She'd screamed for help, called for healers, demanded answers. The official diagnosis: natural causes, heart failure. Tragic, but not suspicious. Sarah knew it was a lie. But she had no proof, no evidence, just the sick certainty that the court had decided Tony was more useful dead than alive. Within 6 months the decree came. Duchess Sarah Gellin would wed Duke Timothy Willett, uniting their territories and ensuring proper succession. Tim had stared at that letter for an hour, trying to process the horror of it. They'd killed his friend, and now they wanted him to marry Tony's widow. Year 3. The breaking point. Sarah arrived at Tim's duchy 7 months before the wedding, looking like she hadn't slept in weeks. Her lands had been merged with his. She now governed 4 towns, 410,000 acres of farmland, and a population of nearly 50,000 people. Alone. "I can't do this," she'd said the first night, sitting in Tim's study with a glass of wine she wasn't drinking. "I'm working 16-hour days. The staff bows and scrapes instead of actually helping. I have to approve every decision, sign every document, attend every council meeting, and they wonder why I'm not smiling." "I know," Tim said quietly. He understood. He was drowning in the same bureaucratic ocean. "I keep thinking." Sarah stopped, her voice breaking. "If I'd never put that dungeon core on the counter, Tony would still be alive." "Sarah?" "They killed him, Tim. I know they did. He was inconvenient, so they killed him." Tim had no argument against that. He suspected she was right. They'd sat in silence for a long time, 2 former adventurers trapped in gilded cages, mourning a friend who died for the crime of being magicless. The wedding day. It should have been beautiful. The ceremony was held in the capital, in the same throne room where they'd been ennobled 3 years earlier. The king presided. The archdiocese performed the rites. Hundreds of nobles attended in their finest clothing. Sarah wore a gown of white and gold. Tim wore formal attire that actually fit this time, the weight he'd gained finally settling into something like normalcy. Sarah stood beside him as his first wife, serene and supportive. Sarah stood as his second wife-to-be, her eyes scanning the crowd. "Where's your father?" Tim whispered as they waited for the ceremony to begin. "He's not here," Sarah said flatly. "Why not? I sent him an invitation personally." "They wouldn't allow it." "What?" Sarah's expression was carved from ice. "A duchess cannot have a commoner father or a commoner mother. As far as the court is concerned, my parents don't exist." Tim felt cold spreading through his chest. "Sarah, where are your parents?" "I don't know. They won't tell me." The ceremony began before Tim could press further. 2 months after the wedding, Sarah was summoned to court. She returned to the duchy 3 days later, accompanied by an elderly woman in expensive clothing. "This is Lady Merivale," Sarah said, her voice completely devoid of emotion. "Apparently, she's my mother now." The woman, 83 years old, with white hair and a permanent expression of disapproval, curtsied to Tim. "Your Grace, I'm honored to serve as Duchess Sarah's adoptive mother." "I have a mother," Sarah said flatly. Lady Merivale's expression didn't change. "Not anymore, dear. The court took care of that." "What?" Sarah said very quietly. "Does took care of that mean?" "It's handled. Don't concern yourself with common matters." Sarah grabbed Tim's arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "They killed my mother." "Now, dear, they killed my mother," Sarah's voice cracked. "And my father. They murdered them because I'm a duchess and duchesses can't have commoner parents. It was necessary for..." Sarah turned to Tim. "I'm done." "What?" "I'm done." Her eyes were blazing now, tears streaming down her face. "This isn't a life. This is a prison. And I won't stay in it anymore." Tim looked at her. Looked at Silthera, who was watching with quiet understanding. looked at Lady Merivale, who represented everything wrong with nobility. "I'm done too," he said. They got into a chariot that afternoon and rode to the capital without announcement or permission. The guards at the palace tried to stop them. Tim showed his duchy seal and pushed past. They were escorted to the throne room, where the king sat in conference with his advisors. "Duke Willett," the king said, surprise and annoyance crossing his features. "This is highly irregular. You should have—" "I'm done," Tim interrupted. Silence fell across the throne room. "I beg your pardon?" "I'm a dungeon lord," Tim said, his voice steady and loud enough to carry. "My purpose in this world is to explore dungeons, to understand them, to protect people from them when necessary. My life is meaningless in nobility. You've stripped away my adventurer's license, forbidden me from doing what I was created to do, and turned me into an administrator signing tax forms." The king's expression darkened. "You were granted. I know what I was granted, and I'm grateful, but it's killing me. So today, I'm invoking a right that most nobles don't know exists." Tim straightened, meeting the king's eyes directly. "I renounce my noble status. From this day forward, I am a commoner." Gasps rippled through the assembled nobles. The king stood. "You cannot." "He can," one of the advisors said quietly. "It's ancient law. The highest levels of nobility, duke and above, retain the right to renounce their titles if they find the burden unbearable. It hasn't been done in 300 years, but it's legal." Sarah stepped forward. "I renounce my noble status as well. I'm done playing at being a duchess. I want my life back." Before the king could respond, Silthara moved to stand beside Tim. "I renounce my position as fourth princess of the Elven throne and my role as emissary to the human kingdom," she said calmly. "I will follow my husband wherever he goes." "You cannot do that," the king sputtered. "You're fourth in line too." The Elven ambassador, who'd been standing quietly in the corner, cleared his throat. "Technically, your majesty, she's not going to be queen regardless. She's 347 years old. Her eldest sister is 520 and in perfect health." Silthara renouncing her position changes nothing politically. Tim turned to Silthara. "How old did you say you were?" 347. "You never mentioned the exact." A sharp slap hit the back of his head. "You don't ask a woman her age," Sarah hissed. "That's inappropriate. Now let's go before they arrest us or something." The three of them turned and walked out of the throne room. Behind them, the king shouted orders. Advisors scrambled, guards moved to intercept, but they made it to the courtyard, untied 3 horses from their chariot, royal horses, technically stolen, but Tim didn't particularly care, resettled the saddles and mounted. "Where to?" Silthara asked. "Back to where it all began," Tim said. "Krahan, I want to see our friends again." They rode out of the capital as the sun set, 3 former nobles fleeing toward freedom. 2 days later, reality sets in. They'd made it 50 miles before Silthara brought up the problem. "Tim, you know you still own your lands, right?" "What?" "The king can't take them back. Once land is granted to a duke, it's permanent. You can renounce your title, but the property still belongs to you." Tim stared at her. "That's insane. That's nobility law. You may be a commoner now, but you still govern 4 towns and 410,000 acres. You still collect taxes. You still own 2 dungeons, and you cannot sell any of it without insulting the king and potentially starting a succession crisis." Sarah made a strangled sound. "Are you telling me we're still stuck?" "Not stuck. But you can't just abandon your territories. You need to appoint someone to govern in your absence. Someone you trust." Tim wanted to scream. They'd renounced their titles. They'd walked away, and they still couldn't be free. "How long will that take?" he asked. "Months, probably," Silthara said apologetically. "You'll need to interview candidates, transfer authorities, establish communication channels. It's not a small undertaking." Tim looked at Sarah. Sarah looked back, defeat written across her face. "So we go back," she said tiredly. "We set things up properly, and then we leave." "Yes. Fine." Sarah turned her horse around. "Let's get this over with." 9 months later. The process was every bit as difficult as Silthara had predicted. They returned to find half the staff had quit. The maids who'd been assigned by royal decree, essentially forced to work for nobility, learned that Tim was now a commoner and immediately resigned. They'd never wanted to be there in the first place. Even Sarah's personal staff, brought from her original estate, left when they learned the news. Nobility meant prestige. Commoners, no matter how wealthy, were beneath them. Only one person stayed, James, Tim's elderly butler, who'd been with the estate since before Tim arrived. "Where are you going to go, Your Grace?" James had asked when Tim told him he was welcome to leave. "I'm not Your Grace anymore, James. You'll always be Your Grace to me, sir. And if you're asking whether I'm leaving, no. I've served this manor for 40 years. I'm too old to start over somewhere else. Besides," he'd smiled slightly, "I rather like the idea of a lord who actually does something useful instead of sitting around collecting taxes." So James stayed. Everyone else left. Tim, Sarah, and Silthera spent 9 months doing what should have been done by a staff of 50. They interviewed candidates for governance. They established messenger pigeon networks for communications. They trained replacements. They sorted through finances, legal documents, tax codes, succession plans. It was exhausting. But finally, in December, 3 years after their ennoblement, they had everything in place. A council would govern the towns. Trusted administrators would handle finances. Regular reports would be sent via pigeon. Tim and Sarah would approve major decisions remotely, but day-to-day operations would run without them. They could finally leave. Departure. They stood in the courtyard of Tim's manor, his manor still, even if he was no longer a duke, with 3 horses saddled and ready. Sarah wore her old adventurer's clothing, the leather armor she'd kept hidden in a trunk for 3 years. It fit perfectly, like coming home. Tim wore simple travel clothes and his knife at his belt. The weight felt right after years of formal coats and ceremonial swords. Silthara wore practical elven attire, reinforced leather and cloth designed for movement. Sarah had given her Tony's blue bottomless bag, and it hung at her side like it had always belonged there. "Ready?" Tim asked. "More than ready," Sarah said. James stood on the manor steps, hands clasped behind his back. "Safe travels, Your Grace, all of you." "We're not. You'll always be Your Grace, sir. Now go. Go do what you were meant to do." They mounted their horses. Tim looked back at the manor one last time. 3 years of his life. 3 years of bureaucracy and loss and slowly dying inside. He turned his horse toward the south, toward Crahan, toward the guild hall where it had all begun. "Let's go home," he said. They rode out as the sun rose, 3 former nobles heading back to the adventurer's life, leaving behind titles and land and the weight of expectations. Behind them, the manor staff watched until they disappeared over the horizon. Ahead of them, dungeons waited. And in the distance, barely audible but growing louder, the voices of dungeons that had been calling for 3 years finally began to quiet. The dungeon lord was coming back, and this time, nothing would stop him. Chapter 7. Homecoming. They arrived in Crahan late at night, 3 riders on horseback emerging from the darkness like ghosts of their former selves. The town had grown in the 3 years since they'd left. New buildings lined the main street. The guild hall had been expanded. Street lamps, actual magical street lamps, illuminated the cobblestones. Prosperity had found Crahan, probably funded by adventurers delving the nearby dungeons. But the people hadn't changed. The moment they rode past the first house, a woman sweeping her doorstep looked up, recognized them, and immediately bowed so low her forehead nearly touched the ground. "Your Graces," she whispered. Others noticed. Doors opened, people emerged, and one by one they bowed. Commoners showing deference to nobility they assumed still held power. Tim felt sick. "They don't know," Sarah said quietly. "No," Silthera agreed. "They don't." They rode through streets lined with bowing figures until they reached the guild hall. Tim dismounted, tied his horse to the post, and pushed through the familiar doors. The effect was immediate. Every person in the common room, adventurers at tables, clerks behind the counter, patrons at the bar, stood at attention as though royalty had just entered. The same clerk who'd registered Tim 3 years ago was still there, older now, more tired. She recognized him immediately and curtsied. "Your Grace, we weren't expecting." "I'd like to register as an adventurer," Tim said, approaching the counter with Sarah and Silthara flanking him. The clerk blinked. "I'm sorry, Your Grace, but nobility is not allowed to register as adventurers. I'm sure you've been told this many times." "I'm no longer noble," Tim said firmly. "I was a duke, but I renounced my title." Silence rippled through the room. The clerk's expression shifted from deference to confusion to something close to panic. "Are you Are you even allowed to do that? Yes, it's an archaic right of anyone who holds a dukedom. If noble life becomes too difficult, they can renounce their title. I studied it for over a year before actually doing it. So you're a commoner again? We're all commoners now, Tim confirmed. Silthera stepped forward. Technically, I'm not a commoner. I'm still royalty by blood, but I've disavowed my position in the elven court, so that's as close to common as I'll ever get. She paused. Rules in the elven kingdom work slightly differently than rules in the human kingdom. Partially because my people live a lot longer. Sarah gave her a look. Yeah, rub it in. The two women had not been getting along well during the journey. Every night when they'd made camp, Sarah had tried to find a comfortable sleeping arrangement. And every night, Silthara would curl up against Tim, kiss him, hold him, sometimes become intimate with him right there in the shared tent. Sarah would quietly gather her bedroll and move outside, sleeping alone under the stars while trying not to think about the sounds coming from the tent. Tim had tried to tell her it was okay. She could stay. They were technically married now. But Sarah couldn't. The idea of sleeping that close while Tim was intimate with someone else, even someone who was also his wife, felt wrong. Invasive, like she was intruding on something private. And divorce didn't exist in the kingdom. They were married for life unless one of them died. The thought made her want to scream. The clerk was still processing. I'll have to contact the capital to verify that what you're saying is true. That you're really commoners now. It'll take about 3 days to hear back. That's fine, Tim said. We'll wait. The clerk nodded and made notes. Then she hesitated. There's something else you should know. The guildmaster has orders from the king himself to open the labyrinth to adventurers. As of tomorrow, people will be allowed to enter. Tim's blood went cold. What? Footsteps on the stairs. The guildmaster descended, the same half-elf woman who'd known Geoffrey, who'd promised to keep Necropolis closed until Tim was ready. She looked older now, tired, defeated. I'm sorry, Tim, she said quietly. I held them off as long as I could. 3 years. But the king's orders are absolute. The labyrinth opens tomorrow, and there's nothing I can do to stop it. Tim wanted to argue. Wanted to rage that the king was an idiot, that sending adventurers into Necropolis was a death sentence, that nobody understood what labyrinths were capable of. But he knew it wouldn't matter. The king had made his decision. How many are planning to enter? Tim asked. 15 parties registered already. 60 adventurers total. The guildmaster shook her head. I've warned them it's dangerous. I've told them it's untested. They don't care. The potential loot from a labyrinth is too tempting. They're gonna die. I know. 3 days of waiting, Tim tried to use the time productively. He took Sarah out to dinner the first night, just the two of them, at a small restaurant away from the guild hall's prying eyes. They sat across from each other, eating in awkward silence, trying to remember how to be friends. This is weird, Sarah said finally. I know. We feel more like cousins than whatever we're supposed to be. Tim nodded. We need to work on that. Over the next few weeks, I want us to have regular dates. Just you and me. Get to know each other properly, romantically. The word felt strange in his mouth. Learn how to be husband and wife instead of just party members. Sarah considered this. That might help, maybe. And I'll do the same with Silthera. Weekly dates, separate quality time. We'll figure this out. You make it sound like a strategy. It is a strategy. I'm treating our marriage like a dungeon. Observe the patterns, adapt, find what works. Sarah laughed, the first genuine laugh Tim had heard from her in months. You're comparing our relationship to a dungeon? I'm good at dungeons. Fair enough. The second night, Tim took Silthera to a different restaurant. They ate elven cuisine, delicate flavors artfully presented, and Silthera tried once again to get Tim to use her preferred name. Please just call me Tata, she said. It's a word of endearment in Elvish. It means beloved or lover. And it's much easier for you to pronounce than my full name. I can say Silthara just fine. You mispronounce it half the time. You keep putting the emphasis on the wrong syllable, and it comes out sounding like you're calling me Stinky Elf. Tim stared at her. I've been calling you Stinky Elf for 3 years. Yes. Why didn't you tell me? I did. Multiple times. You kept insisting you were saying it correctly. They argued about this for 2 hours before Tim finally conceded. Fine, Tada, I'll call you Tada. She smiled, radiant and beautiful. Thank you. The third night, he brought them both to dinner together. They sat at a corner table, and Tim laid out his plan. Weekly dates, he said, rotating. 1 week I take Sarah out alone. Next week I take Tada out alone. The week after that, all three of us together. We build intimacy separately and collectively. You really are treating this like a strategy, Sarah said. It's what I know how to do. Tada took his hand. It's not a bad plan. Unconventional marriages require unconventional approaches. All the work is behind us now, Tim said, trying to convince himself as much as them. We can focus on being a party again, on dungeons, on what we're supposed to be doing. Tada's smile was gentle but sad. Not really, my love. The territories still need managing. The messenger pigeons will still arrive with problems. But I understand what you mean. Tim was tired. So incredibly tired of complications and politics and responsibilities. He just wanted to go into a dungeon. The attempted escape that night, after Sarah and Tada had gone to sleep, Tim slipped out his window. He moved quietly through Cran's streets, heading west toward the hills where Necropolis waited. If he could just see it, just assess it, maybe he could understand what the king was sending those adventurers into. He reached the town gate. 2 guards stepped into his path, spears crossed. Sorry, Your Grace, one said. We can't let you leave. What? Guildmaster's orders? You're not to leave town until your noble status is verified. If you try, we're authorized to detain you, including putting you in a holding cell if necessary. Tim stared at them. I'm not a prisoner. No, Your Grace, but you're not verified as a commoner either. Until we know for sure, you stay in Cran. He'd renounced his title. He'd walked away from the duchy. He'd traveled hundreds of miles to come home, and he was still in a cage. Tim turned and walked back to the inn, his hands clenched into fists. He hadn't escaped at all. 2 months later, the response didn't come in 3 days. It didn't come in a week. Weeks turned into months, while the capital deliberated, discussed, and debated what to do about a duke who'd renounced his title. During that time, adventurers entered Necropolis. The first party of 5 went in and never came out. The second party lasted longer. They made it to the 3rd floor before the labyrinth killed them all. By the end of the first month, 43 adventurers had died in Necropolis. The guildmaster closed it again, but the damage was done. The king was furious that his orders had resulted in such catastrophic losses. The guild was scrambling to explain, and Tim watched it all happen from behind the invisible bars of his noble status. Finally, 2 months after they'd arrived in Cran, the response came. A royal courier delivered it personally, a sealed letter bearing the king's mark. Tim opened it with Sarah and Tada watching over his shoulder. By royal decree, the renunciation of Duke Timothy Willett and Duchess Sarah Willett, née Jellin, is hereby recognized but modified. A new classification is established, lower nobility. Lower nobility is defined as individuals of ducal rank or higher who choose to pursue a commoner's lifestyle while retaining territorial responsibilities. Duke Willett and Duchess Willett are classified as lower nobility. They retain their titles and lands but are granted all rights and privileges of commoners, including the right to register as adventurers. This classification is unique to them and may not be applied retroactively to other nobles. Furthermore, the previous renunciation is declared null and void. Duke Willett and Duchess Willett are reinstated to full ducal status under the lower nobility designation. So decreed by His Majesty, King Aldrich Theron III. Tim read it 3 times. They created a new classification just for us, Sarah said, disbelief in her voice. Lower nobility, Tada read. Clever. You retain the title and responsibilities but gain commoner freedoms. So we're still Duke and Duchess, Tim said flatly. Yes, but you can also be adventurers. Tim looked at Sarah. Sarah looked back. Does this mean we can go into dungeons? She asked. I have no idea. They found out at the guild hall an hour later. The clerk, who'd been waiting anxiously for the royal response, read the decree and nearly wept with relief. You can register, she said. Lower nobility status grants you adventurer privileges. What rank? Tim asked. She checked her records. You're being reinstated at your previous ranks. Sarah, your C rank. Tim, your F rank. F rank? Sarah said. The lowest possible rank? He only completed 2 dungeons before ennoblement, the clerk explained, and one of those was incomplete. F rank is appropriate for his documented experience. Tim didn't care. F rank, A rank, it didn't matter. What mattered was the adventurer plate the clerk handed him. Metal engraved with his name and rank, proof that he was allowed to enter dungeons again. After 3 years, he was free. Preparations. They spent a week gathering supplies, rope, torches, medical supplies, food and water, everything they'd need for extended dungeon delving. Tata purchased elven armor, lightweight and flexible but enchanted for protection. Sarah replaced her old sword with something better balanced. Tim kept his knife but added a proper sword to his belt, something with reach. They tested their bottomless bags, still functional, still holding the wealth and items the baby core had given them years ago. And they planned. "Where do we start?" Sarah asked one night over dinner. Tim had been thinking about this. Hollow Roots. The first dungeon we ever ran. Yes, I want to see an old friend, get reacquainted with dungeons before we tackle anything serious. And, he paused, I want to say hello. Sarah understood. Hollow Roots had been kind to them, terrified but cooperative. The first dungeon to recognize what Tim was and choose survival over pride. She deserved a visit. "When do we leave?" Tata asked. "Tomorrow morning," Tim said. "Early, before the guild has a chance to create more bureaucratic obstacles." They agreed. That night, Tim barely slept. Excitement hummed through him like electricity. The same feeling he'd had 3 years ago before entering his first dungeon. He was going back. The dungeon lord was going home. The journey to Hollow Roots. They left Cran at dawn, 3 riders heading east into the forest. The path was overgrown now. Fewer adventurers came this way, since bigger more lucrative dungeons had been discovered. But Tim remembered the route perfectly, guided by inherited knowledge and muscle memory. The clearing appeared after 2 hours of riding. The stone archway stood exactly as Tim remembered, carved with reality-warping symbols, surrounded by dead grass, marking the entrance to something that shouldn't exist. But something was different. The air around the entrance felt warm. Welcoming, almost. Tim dismounted and approached slowly. From inside the dungeon, carried on a breeze that had no source, came a voice he recognized. Female, young, grateful. "You returned." Tim smiled. "Hello, Hollow Roots. I'm back. I thought you had forgotten me." "Never. I've been busy, but I promised I'd visit again." Sarah and Tata joined him at the entrance, staring at the archway with different expressions. Sarah nostalgic, Tata curious. "She's talking to you," Tata said. It wasn't a question. "Yes? What's she saying?" "That she's glad I came back." Tim placed his hand on the archway's stone. "We're coming in, Hollow Roots, just a visit. We're not here to hurt you." "I know. You never were." They stepped through together, into darkness that resolved into phosphorescent-lit tunnels, and Tim felt something settle in his chest that had been absent for 3 years. Purpose. He was home. Chapter 7, Part 2, The 1,000 Floors. Tim stood before Hollow Root's entrance and spoke into the darkness. "Challenge me," he said. "Push me to my limit." The response came immediately, carried on wind that had no source, female and frightened. "You're gonna kill me." "No. I want you to try and kill me." "But why?" "Because I need to know if I'm still capable. 3 years away from dungeons, I need to know if I can still do this." Silence. Then, more hesitant. "I'm not sure if you know this, but a labyrinth spawned from a dungeon that tried to harm a child core." Tim's blood went cold. "What?" "Necropolis, the one west of here. It absorbed a baby dungeon. Parasitized it. That's against the rules. No dungeon is allowed to harm another dungeon." "Are you certain of this?" "Yes," Tim said quietly. "I was there. I freed the baby core. That's why Marrow transformed into Necropolis. He was unstable without her." "Thank you for telling me this. I will give you a challenge. If you make it to my core, I will give you a prize. But I may go quiet for a moment. I need to contact the All-Cube." The wind stopped. The presence receded. Tim turned to find Sarah and Tata staring at him. "What's the All-Cube?" Sarah asked. "I have no idea," Tim admitted. Tata spoke quietly. "It's the core of cores, the grandfather of dungeons, the one in charge." She looked at Tim with something like awe. "Just as we have a king who rules over the kingdom and nobility who govern territories, dungeons have hierarchy. Hollow Roots would be considered a duchess among dungeons. She's going to speak to their emperor and tell him what she learned about Necropolis." "Dungeons have hierarchy?" Sarah asked. "Laws?" "Yes," Tata said. "Their laws are more concrete than ours. given they sometimes live thousands of years before being conquered. Most people think of dungeons as ways to make money, but they're civilizations unto themselves. And when humans die in dungeons, if they're left too long, they get reabsorbed. That fuel sometimes creates new dungeon bosses. That's why you sometimes see skeletons walking the halls. They're not just dungeon monsters. They were people once. Sarah looked ill. You're saying those undead creatures are trapped souls? Their bodies become part of the dungeon, their souls trapped until the dungeon is destroyed. It's why killing a dungeon is considered mercy for some. It releases everyone absorbed. Tim had known this intellectually, part of his inherited knowledge. But hearing it explained out loud made it feel more real. More terrible. So what are you having her do for you? Sarah asked. I'm asking her to test me. Every trap she has, every trick, I want her to use dungeon code to try and stop me from reaching her core. I need to relearn how to read dungeons properly. You're not going to kill her, are you? No, if I reach her core, she's giving us a prize. Do you know what it is? Tim smiled slightly. I have suspicions. If I'm right, we'll only need to do dungeons for fun from now on. We already have enough money to last our entire lives, Sarah pointed out. This is true. They waited at the entrance. Minutes passed, then an hour. Finally, Hollowroot's presence returned, warmer now, almost eager. I'm ready. Come inside. I will test you, Dungeon Lord. Try not to die. How many floors do you have? Tim asked, but the presence was already gone, focused inward on rearranging her architecture. Tim looked at his companions. Ready? As will ever be, Sarah said. They stepped through. The first 6 hours. The first floor was different than Tim remembered. Hollowroots had changed everything. Corridors that had been straight were now twisted. Traps that had been obvious were concealed. Monsters that had been predictable now moved in coordinated patterns. But Tim could still see it all. His dungeon hacker ability activated the moment they entered, showing him the layout in perfect detail. But now there were complications, places where the information flickered, as though Hollowroots was actively trying to confuse his reading. She was using dungeon code against him, adapting in real time. Left corridor, Tim said. Trap in 20 feet, pressure plate that triggers ceiling collapse. Step over the discolored stone. They did. The ceiling didn't fall. Right passage, monster ambush in the alcove ahead. 3 root crawlers, coordinated attack pattern. Sarah, take left. Tata, take right. I'll handle center. The monsters attacked. Tim struck the nerve cluster on his with perfect precision. It died instantly. Sarah's took 3 strikes. Tata's took 5. But they won. 6 hours passed like minutes. They moved through chamber after chamber, floor after floor, fighting and solving and adapting. The first floor boss appeared, a massive root construct, twice the size of the one they'd fought years ago. It took them 40 minutes to kill it. They descended to the second floor. The realization. This is different, Sarah said as they rested after the second floor. I thought Hollowroots only had 20 floors. Everyone thinks that, Tim said, but I'm not sensing a bottom yet. What do you mean? When I enter a dungeon, I can usually sense how deep it goes, the pressure of floors stacked below. But with Hollowroots, he paused. I can't find the bottom. Tata looked thoughtful. What if everyone's been wrong? What if Hollowroots is more than a starter dungeon? They found out on the 10th floor. Unlike other dungeons with bosses every 2 levels, Hollowroots only had bosses every 10 floors. The 10th floor boss was a nightmare, a creature of root and bone that took them 4 hours to kill. Tim tried to use Final Blow, his ability to strike the exact failure point and kill instantly. But he couldn't find the spot. The creature's vulnerability shifted constantly, moving through its body like water. He finally found it in the ceiling above the creature, a nerve root connecting to the dungeon itself. He'd had to climb up the creature's back, grab onto roots growing through the walls, and stab the connection point 28 times before it finally severed and the boss died. They collapsed afterward, exhausted beyond anything they'd felt in years. We call it here, Tim said. Make camp, rest. Floor 18, 14 hours. And they'd only dealt with 2 floor bosses so far. The power difference between them was staggering. The first had been manageable, but the second had nearly killed them. How deep does this go? Sarah asked as they set up camp in a side corridor. I don't know, Tim admitted, but we're not at the bottom yet. They made a fire, small, controlled, using wood from broken crates they'd found in treasure rooms. Tim volunteered for first watch. "You're the one who needs sleep most," Sarah protested. "You've been navigating for 14 hours straight." "I'll be fine." "Tim, you're exhausted. I'll take first watch." Tada agreed. "Sleep, my love. We'll wake you if anything happens." Tim was too tired to argue. He lay down on his bedroll, and Tada curled up beside him. They had their nightly routine, quiet conversation, gentle touches, intimacy that made Sarah politely retreat to the far side of the camp and pretend very hard not to hear anything. By 3 in the morning, Tada rose and relieved Sarah from watch. Sarah settled onto her bedroll gratefully and fell asleep almost immediately. The morning after, Sarah woke to warmth. She was in someone's arms, pressed against a familiar chest, breathing in sync with another person's heartbeat. Tim. Sometime during the night, she'd moved closer to him. Or he'd moved closer to her. Either way, they'd ended up tangled together, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. Without thinking, Sarah reached up and pulled him closer and kissed him. Soft, brief, instinctive. Their eyes opened at the same moment, inches apart, both realizing what had just happened. Sarah pushed away, her face burning. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean." "It's fine," Tim said quickly. "We're married. It's fine. I know we're married. I'm sorry." "Me too." They stared at each other awkwardly until Tada's laughter broke the tension. "You two are hilarious," she said from her position by the fire. "You act like school children when you're actually husband and wife. You know it's okay to be romantic with each other. We can even all be romantic together if you'd like." "No," Sarah said immediately. "I don't go that way." Tada laughed again. "Like I said, school children. Come, eat. I have food ready for your bellies." Tim sat up. "Haha, very funny." They gathered around the fire, and Tada began pulling food from her bag. Soup, stew, fresh bread, fruit. More food than should have been possible. "What is that bag?" Sarah asked, watching Tada produce an entire roasted chicken from a pouch the size of her hand. "A gift from our husband for my birthday a few years ago," Tada explained. "If I eat something I like, I take one bite and put the rest in the bag. From that moment on, I can pull out infinite copies. The original stays inside, fully restored, and what I pull out are identical replicas." "So you have unlimited food?" "Pretty much, and since Tim likes so many different things, I've been sure to stock all his favorites. Once I know your favorites, I'll add them too." "Does it give the same sustenance as regular food?" "Yes, it's not a useless copy. It's identical to the original in every way." They ate in silence, processing. Then they packed up and continued deeper. Floor 20, the lie. The next boss took 9 hours to kill. By the end, Sarah had been injured, a deep gash on her arm that Tada had to bandage while Tim held the boss's attention. They won, but barely. They descended to the 21st floor and stopped. "Wait," Sarah said. "Everyone thinks Hollow Roots only has 20 floors." "Everyone's wrong," Tim said, staring down the corridor that continued into darkness. The dungeon went deeper. Much deeper. 6 months later, the surface world. In Krahen, days had turned to weeks, weeks to months. The guildmaster waited, checked reports, sent scouts to nearby dungeons. No sign of Duke Willet's party. After 6 months, she sent word to the capital. "It is possible Duke Willet and his companions are dead." Royal knights were dispatched. They checked every known dungeon in the region. They even found Hollow Roots and delved to the 20th floor, which everyone believed was the bottom. They found nothing. No bodies, no signs of battle, no evidence that anyone had been there recently. The search was called off. The king refused to reabsorb Tim's assets without confirmation of death. Duke Willet could be in a labyrinth, which could take a year to complete. But 1 year turned to 2. 2 turned to 5. After 5 years, most people assumed the dungeon lord was dead. Floor 100, time dilates. They didn't know how long they'd been in the dungeon. After floor 20, things changed. The next floor wasn't a corridor or chamber. It was a landscape. Several hundred kilometers in every direction, with a sun that blazed at 140 degrees Fahrenheit day and night. The boss was a 7-horned bison that could run faster than horses and hit like a battering ram. It took them 2 days to kill it. After that, every floor had a boss. Every floor was a trial. Time seemed to move differently here. What felt like hours might have been days. What felt like days might have been weeks. They lost track. They just kept descending, kept fighting, kept surviving. Floor 1000, the core. When they finally reached it, none of them could quite believe it. A chamber of crystalline beauty, walls that pulsed with soft green light, and in the center, Hollow Root's core. It was massive, easily 6 feet in diameter, a sphere of living wood and crystal that radiated warmth and gratitude and relief. "You made it," Hollow Roots whispered. "Floor 1000, you've defeated my dungeon." "How long?" Tim asked. "How long have we been down here?" "Time moves differently in my deep floors. For you, it's been perhaps 6 months. For the surface, longer." Sarah felt cold spreading through her chest. "How much longer?" 5 years. Silence. 5 years? Sarah's voice cracked. "We've been down here for 5 years? I'm sorry. I tried to warn you, but you were so focused on the challenge." Tim took a breath, processed. "What's done is done." "You said you had a prize?" "Yes." A pedestal rose from the floor. On it sat a single vial filled with shimmering liquid that seemed to contain starlight. "Hollow Tears, Hollow Roots," said, "the rarest gift a dungeon can give. A reusable healing potion that refills at the light of every full moon. I've held this for 300 years, waiting for someone worthy to receive it." Tata picked up the vial reverently. This is national treasure level rare. Wars have been fought over items like this. "It's yours," Hollow Roots said. "All of yours, for treating me with kindness, for giving me a chance to prove myself, for being my friend." Tim approached the core slowly. Hollow Root's presence retreated slightly, afraid despite herself. And Tim did something that made both Sarah and Tata gasp. He hugged the dungeon core, wrapped his arms around the massive crystal sphere and held it gently. Then he kissed it, just a soft press of lips against smooth crystal. "Thank you, my old friend," he whispered. "Take care. I'll see you again." The dungeon's presence exploded with joy so profound it made the walls shake. Did you know what you just did? Showed affection to a friend?" "In dungeon law, that was a marriage proposal. And by not trying to kill you, I accepted." Tim blinked. "What?" Tata was grinning. "Congratulations, husband. You just married a dungeon." "I what?" "It's the greatest honor a dungeon can receive," Hollow Roots said shyly. "To be claimed as a dungeon lord's wife. I will be yours for as long as I exist. My floors are your home. My treasures are your wealth. And I will protect you and yours until my core shatters." Sarah started laughing, the kind of slightly hysterical laughter that comes from exhaustion and absurdity and 5 years of dungeon delving. "You married a dungeon," she wheezed. "You actually married a 1,000-floor dungeon." "I didn't mean to." "Doesn't matter. You're married now." Sarah wiped tears from her eyes. "Congratulations, Tim. You have 3 wives." Tata was still grinning. "I like her already." Tim looked between them, then at the dungeon core, then back at them. "Can we please just go home now?" The return Hollow Roots provided a teleportation circle directly to the surface. They emerged in the original entrance chamber, blinking in afternoon sunlight. Their horses were gone, taken by the royal knights who'd searched months ago. They walked back to Crehen on foot, carrying their packs, looking like they'd aged a decade. The first person who saw them dropped their basket in shock. "They're alive!" someone screamed. Word spread like wildfire. By the time they reached the guild hall, a crowd had gathered. Hugs, handshakes, tears, people who'd thought them dead for years. The guildmaster descended the stairs, but not the half-elf woman Tim remembered. This was a young woman, barely 18, with the same pale blue eyes. "What happened to?" Tim started. "My grandmother passed away 4 years ago," the young woman said gently. "I'm Lillian. I took over as guildmaster when she died." 4 years, Tim repeated numbly. "Sir, you've been gone for 5 years. The king gave up looking for you. Nobody could find you in any surrounding dungeons. Most people thought you were dead." Sarah sat down heavily on a bench. 5 years. We lost 5 years. "But you're alive," Lillian said, "and that's what matters. Do you have materials to turn in?" "Yes," Tim said, "but not tonight. I'll write a report and bring it tomorrow. Right now, we need sleep." "Of course. Your rooms at the inn are still being held. The king paid the fees in case you returned. Go, rest. We'll handle everything else in the morning." They walked to the inn in a daze. The innkeeper stared at them like they were ghosts, then scrambled to prepare their room. A giant bed. Big enough for all 3 of them. They collapsed onto it fully clothed, too exhausted to even remove their boots. 5 years, Sarah whispered. We defeated a 1,000-floor dungeon, Tata said. And Tim married it, Sarah added. Tim groaned and pulled a pillow over his face. They fell asleep like that. 3 adventurers who'd just completed something impossible, lost half a decade in the process, and somehow made it home alive. Outside, Cran celebrated their return. And deep below the earth, in a chamber of crystal and living wood, Hollowroots hummed with contentment. She was a dungeon lord's wife now, and that was worth any price. Chapter 8. Old Stories versus New Knowledge. The next morning, Tata was up before dawn, practically vibrating with excitement. 5 years. 5 years trapped in a dungeon, fighting for their lives, never seeing the sun. And now they were out. Free. In a town with shops and markets and civilization, she wanted to go shopping. She stood over Tim's sleeping form, watching him breathe deeply, completely unconscious. He'd probably sleep until noon if she let him. Sarah was also still dead to the world, curled up on the far side of the bed. Tata couldn't wait. She burst out the front door, practically dancing down the stairs, and headed straight for the shopping district. She had a mission. Find a new dress. Something nice. Something that matched the jewelry she'd acquired in Hollowroots. The ring on her finger was blue-green crystal, perfectly matching her eyes. The bracelet on her wrist was similar. Delicate silver worked with the same colored stones. The necklace at her throat completed the set, all 3 pieces harmonizing beautifully. What she didn't know, what none of them fully understood yet, was that these weren't just pretty jewelry. The ring, acquired on the 90th floor, granted the ability to phase through walls. The bracelet, earned on the 300th floor, allowed the wearer to hear the words of dungeons. The necklace, received on the 954th floor, granted the ability to speak back to them. Dungeon Lord abilities, condensed into wearable form. Having all 3 on one person was astronomical. The kind of equipment that nations went to war over. But to Tata, they were just well-earned rewards for a really challenging adventure. Now she needed a dress and shoes and leggings and makeup to make it all look perfect. She had a whole day of shopping planned, and this was her challenge. Find the perfect outfit to match her perfect jewelry. Sarah woke next, stretched luxuriously, and made an immediate decision. Bathhouse. All day. No arguments. She got dressed, left a note for Tim that she didn't expect him to read, and headed to the local bathhouse. As a technically still noble, she could pull on some of those privileges she'd hated during her years of forced nobility. But now she could have fun with it. The bathhouse attendants recognized her status immediately and scrambled to provide the best service. Private room. Hot water constantly refreshed. Food brought to the edge of the tub whenever she wanted. And later, oh yes, later, she was getting a massage. Maybe even a foot massage after being on her feet non-stop for what felt like months. 1,000 floors, she thought, sinking into the hot water with a groan of pure bliss. The world thinks Hollowroots only has 20 floors, and we discovered it actually has 1,000. The world was going to lose its mind when Tim turned in that report. But that was his business. Sarah had better plans for her day. She disappeared beneath the water's surface and decided not to emerge for at least 6 hours. Tim slept until noon. He woke slowly, reaching out for warm bodies that should have been beside him, finding only empty bed. "Tata?" he mumbled. "Sarah?" Silence. Then in his mind, clear as a bell. "Good morning, honey." Tim sat bolt upright. "Hollowroots? Yes, I can hear you from here. I can speak to you in your mind now that we're married. And you can contact me wherever you are, just by thinking of me. From this moment on, we're always connected." Tim realized, with dawning horror, that a piece of his privacy was now in the hands of a dungeon. "I can finally see the outside world," Hollowroots continued, her mental voice full of wonder. "I've always wondered what your world looks like. I can view it from your eyes and see what you see. But if you don't want me to, I understand. I can back away." "No, it's fine," Tim said, rubbing his face. "Enjoy the view. But when I start talking with the guild, do not interrupt." "Yes, sir. Husband. Master." "Let's stick with husband." "Okay, husband." Tim got dressed, throwing his dungeon-worn clothes into the corner. They reeked of sweat and monster blood and 5 years of accumulated grime. He pulled on fresh garments, completely forgetting to shower, and sprayed himself with cologne to mask the smell. Then he sat at the small desk in the room and began writing his report. It took 2 hours to document everything. The 1,000 floors, the challenges, the time dilation, the dragon species on floor 900, the serpent god, the items they'd acquired. When he finished, he gathered his materials and headed to the guild hall. Lillian, the young guildmaster, was waiting at the counter when he arrived. "Duke Willett," she said formally, "I trust you slept well?" "Well enough." Tim set his pack on the counter. "I have my report and materials to turn in." "Excellent. Let's start with the report." She opened the document and began reading. Her eyes widened. You went beyond floor 20? "Yes. How far?" 1,000 floors. Lillian dropped the report. "I'm sorry, did you say 1,000? "Yes, Hollow Roots has 1,000 floors. Floor 20 is just where the real challenge begins. After that, it gets exponentially harder with each level." Lillian picked up the report with shaking hands. "This is going to change everything. Every adventurer in the kingdom thinks Hollow Roots is a beginner dungeon. 20 floors, manageable challenges, good for training. It's a death trap for anyone unprepared," Tim said flatly. "I'm making an official rule as dungeon owner." Lillian looked up sharply. "You completed it? You reached the core?" "Yes. Which means I get to establish one rule that applies to all future adventurers. Anyone who breaks that rule loses the ability to delve dungeons in this region for life." "What's your rule?" Tim took a breath. "Hollow Roots dungeon core is not allowed to be touched. I've asked her to seal off the core chamber whenever someone is inside. If they make it to floor 1,000, she's allowed to give them the second best gift for reaching that point, not the first." "Why not the first?" "Because..." Tim felt ridiculous saying it. "She's my wife." Silence. "I'm sorry," Lillian said slowly. "Did you say your wife?" "Apparently dungeons have laws I wasn't aware of, and I accidentally proposed marriage by dungeon custom. So yes, technically, I'm married to Hollow Roots." "Let me get this straight." Lillian set down her pen carefully. "You're married to a dungeon?" "Yes." "A dungeon. An inanimate." "She's not inanimate," Tim interrupted. "Dungeons are alive. I'm a dungeon lord. This is what my kind deal with. We know they're sentient, aware, and so capable of choice. Most people treat them as profitable ways to make money, but they're actually much more than that." Lillian processed this. "All right, fine. We'll say they're alive. What materials do you have to turn in?" Tim began unpacking. Boss cores from various floors, rare materials, monster parts, enchanted items. And then he set something on the counter that made Lillian go very still. A crystal vial filled with liquid that seemed to contain captured moonlight. "Is that what I think it is?" she whispered. "Moonlight tears, also called hollow tears, a reusable healing potion that refills at every full moon. That's..." Lillian couldn't seem to find words. "That's a national treasure. Wars have been fought over items like this. Hollow Roots gave it to us for completing her dungeon. We're keeping it." Of course you are." Lillian made notes with shaking hands. "What else?" Tim explained the floors systematically. Floor 601 was purely psychological torture. No monsters, just sound-based attacks designed to drive adventurers insane. The only escape was finding a specific red root, extracting its nectar, and forcing yourself to fall asleep. If you couldn't sleep, you'd be trapped there until you died. Floor 900 introduced dragon species, culminating in a dragon hydra that was nearly impossible to kill. "We actually had to run past it," Tim admitted. "Fought for 15 hours straight. We were about to fall unconscious from exhaustion, so I picked up the girls, ran to the far end of the chamber, and jumped down a hole to the next floor." "You jumped?" "It worked. We landed in a sand terrain on floor 901. That's where we fought the serpent god." "The what?" "A massive snake creature. Size of a mountain. It swallowed me whole." Tim pulled out a core the size of a large melon. "I cut through its insides, made my way into its bloodstream, found its heart, and destroyed it from within. This is its core." Lillian stared at the core. "Holy, do you realize what you can make from this? Dozens of magical items, maybe hundreds. That's why I'm turning it in. You'll need to send most of this to the king. It's too valuable for a local guild to handle." "You're sure you want to sell this?" "I'm sure. I already have more money than I need for several lifetimes. But I love adventuring, and so do my wives. I'm happy to sell what we don't need personally." They talked for 4 more hours, going through every floor, every challenge, every treasure. Lillian took detailed notes, occasionally stopping to ask clarifying questions or simply stare in disbelief. By the time Tim left, the sun was setting. He found Tata and Sarah walking back to the inn from opposite directions. Sarah looked relaxed for the first time in years, her skin glowing from hours in hot water. Tata looked incredible. She wore a new dress, deep blue-green silk that perfectly matched her jewelry and eyes. Her hair was styled in elaborate braids woven with silver thread. She wore new shoes, delicate makeup, and moved with a grace that took Tim's breath away. "Hey," Sarah said as they converged. "How'd it go with the guild?" "Good. Turned in most of the materials, kept the important stuff." Tim looked around the darkening street. "We should probably head back to the inn." "Actually," Sarah said, "I've been thinking. I want to get a house, something we can live in besides the inn, a real home." "Okay," Tim agreed. "We can go shopping for one tomorrow." "That sounds good," Tata said quietly. There was something in her tone. Tim looked at her properly for the first time since they'd met up. "What do you think?" she asked. "About what?" The look on her face could have peeled paint off a rusted ship. Sarah winced. "Tim, you really need to learn how to understand women." "What? You don't see it?" Sarah gestured to Tata. "The dress, the hair, the makeup. She spent all day getting ready, and you didn't notice anything?" Tim looked at Tata again. "The dress, the hair, the jewelry catching streetlight. You look nice," he said. Tata's expression went from hurt to furious. She walked past him without a word, straight toward the inn, her posture rigid. At the door she turned. "Feed yourself tonight." "What?" "You opened your mouth and inserted your foot," Sarah said. "Hope it tastes great. I'm with her on this. You're eating by yourself tonight." They went inside. The door closed. Tim stood in the street, completely baffled. "What did I do?" he asked the empty air. He ended up at a barbecue shack on the edge of town. People recognized him. Nobility, even lower nobility, stood out. They bowed, scraped, offered the best table. But once he sat down and started eating, they relaxed. Realized he was just hungry. Just a person, despite the title. Tim ate well into the night. Ribs, brisket, bread, beer. He kept thinking about what he'd done wrong, and no answer made sense. Tata had looked beautiful. He'd said she looked nice. What more did she want? Finally, after midnight, he trudged back to the inn. The door to their room was locked. He knocked. "Tata? Sarah? Can you let me in?" Silence. He knocked again. "I'm sorry, I think? I'm not sure what I did, but I'm sorry." Still nothing. Tim tried the handle one more time, then gave up. He rolled himself in the carpet runner outside the door and lay down on the hard floor, cold and shivering. "Right before I pass out," he thought, "I really need to learn how to understand my wives better." Inside the room, Tata and Sarah sat on the bed, arms crossed. "Think he gets it?" Sarah asked. "Not even a little," Tata said, "but he'll learn, eventually. Should we let him in?" "In the morning, let him suffer first." They smiled at each other, the first moment of genuine solidarity between them, and settled in to sleep while their husband froze in the hallway. And just like that, the day ended. Chapter 8, Part 2. When hard nights make sore husbands. Tim woke to pain. Every muscle ached. His back was stiff from sleeping on hard floor. His neck had a crick that made turning his head agony. The carpet runner had left textured imprints on his face. He tried the door one more time. It opened. The room was empty. Sarah and Tata were already gone. Tim felt a wave of sadness wash over him. He still didn't understand what he'd done wrong. He'd complimented Tata. She'd looked nice. What more was he supposed to say? He climbed into the actual bed, soft, warm, welcoming, and fell asleep for another 4 hours. The white cat, no meow. Sarah and Tata sat in a small restaurant on the edge of the market district. The place was run by 2 beast folk girls, catkin with pointed ears and tails that swished as they moved. The food they served was incredible. Spiced meats, fresh bread, eggs prepared 6 different ways, and a drink that could only be found in establishments like this. A sweet, creamy beverage made from ground beans and honey that Sarah had become instantly addicted to. "This is amazing," Sarah said around a mouthful of eggs. "One of these days we need to bring Tim here." Tata looked up from her plate. "Only if he behaves." Sarah laughed. "You really need to get past that, you know? He's just a guy. It's going to take him a while to understand what he did wrong." "I know." Tata set down her fork. "It's just, I put so much work into looking my best for him, and for him to just say, 'You look nice,' It really hurt. I felt like he didn't care, like I was just fine being ordinary. I wanted to be special for him, and he didn't see it. Didn't see all the work I did, or the fact that I matched all the colors perfectly, or any of it. I don't understand human men, she added quietly. What do you mean, human men? Elven men would see exactly what you did and give you the correct compliment every time. They're taught from a young age to notice these things, to appreciate effort and beauty properly. Tata sighed. I guess I should understand that Tim is technically human. In a way. Sarah was quiet for a moment. I'm also sad that the fact he's human means him and I will be out of your life a lot sooner than you'd want. Tata looked at her sharply. Actually, you may not know this, but Tim will live at least 800 or 900 years beyond you. Wait, what? His kind don't age the same way we do. Humans age over 100 years or so. Elves age over 3,000 years. I'll literally be 2,900 years old before I start showing signs of aging. Tata paused. Tim will be closer to 800, almost 900 years old before he starts looking like an old man. Sarah felt her breath catch. I'm going to die before him. By centuries. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her last thoughts would be saying goodbye to him. She'd grow old, wither, fade, while he remained young and vital for hundreds of years more. Tears welled in her eyes. Sarah, I didn't mean to make you sad. Tata reached across the table, taking her hand. I just wanted you to see the perspective. Why it's important now for you to build a real relationship with him while you can. Otherwise, you're going to act like school children all the way to the day you die. You don't want that. You need to find a way to see him romantically. Stop seeing him as family, and start seeing him as the one you love. Sarah didn't want to admit it, but she did love him. She'd never said it out loud. How could she, when their marriage had been forced by royal decree? When there'd been no courtship, no choice, no romance? When they'd been commanded to wed like pieces being moved on a game board? But she loved him anyway. I just don't know how to. Sarah trailed off, frustrated. Start small, Tata suggested. Stop pulling away when he tries to be affectionate. Kiss him back when he kisses you. Sleep beside him instead of moving to the far side of the tent. Let yourself be vulnerable. They talked for the next 4 hours, eating and drinking and slowly building something that neither of them had expected. Friendship. Two women who loved the same man, figuring out how to love each other too. Tim's morning. Tim finally dragged himself to the inn's main bath area. Fresh water was brought in, hot, steaming, scented with herbs. He sank into it with a groan that Hollow Roots definitely heard through their mental connection. Are you all right, husband? Just sore, Tim said aloud, then remembered he could think of her. Slept on the floor. Bad decision. Why did you sleep on the floor? Because I said something wrong and got locked out of my room. What did you say? I told Tata she looked nice. There was a long pause. Then, oh husband, that's not enough. What do you mean, not enough? She looked nice. She looked beautiful. She spent hours preparing herself. She wanted you to notice every detail, to be stunned by her effort, to make her feel like the most important person in the world. And you said nice like you were commenting on the weather. Tim sank lower in the bath. I'm terrible at this. You'll learn. Or you'll sleep on many more floors. He finished bathing, dressed in fresh clothes, and examined himself in the mirror. Clean, presentable, not particularly impressive, but better than he'd been. Husband, you're attractive, Hollowroot said suddenly. Tim blinked. Thank you? You're welcome. Now go feed yourself. You get grumpy when you're hungry. Tim headed deep into town to a place called the Brazen Brisket. The Brazen Brisket, they served breakfast early. Roast bacon, roast ham, sausages, eggs, and something called flat cakes. Thin, round cakes that you poured honey and butter on. Tim tried one, then ordered 5 more plates. The staff couldn't believe how much he ate. When he finally finished, he paid at the counter and handed one of the serving girls a small gold coin. Thank you so much, he said. The food was excellent. The girl, young, maybe 16, with a black band around her wrist that Tim thought was a fashion accessory, stared at the coin like she'd never seen one before. Thank you, sir, she whispered. After Tim left, the owner snatched the coin from her hand. That's mine, he said. You don't get tips, you get room and board. That's enough for your kind. The girl cried in the back room, but Tim was already gone. He didn't know about the black band's true meaning, didn't know she was a slave, didn't know the kingdom permitted such things. He'd find out later, much later, and when he did, he'd be furious. Quests. Tim made his way to the guild and examined the quest board. Most were routine, escort missions, material gathering, monster hunting, but a few caught his eye. Elderly woman, 83 years old, needs gutters cleaned, offering 1 silver. Waited several weeks. Wood chopping needed for winter, 2 silver. Goblin nest outside town limits. Small infestation, 5 silver. Man needs help preparing anniversary meal for wife. Must have cooking experience, 3 silver. None of them were particularly lucrative. None required a party, but they were things Tim could do alone, things that would help people. He took all 4. As he left the guild, Sarah and Tata were approaching from the opposite direction. They saw him, tried calling out, but the street noise drowned them out. By the time they reached the door, he was gone. What was he doing here? Sarah asked. They went inside and checked the board. He took 4 quests, the clerk said. Solo work, looks like. Sarah and Tata examined what was left and found something interesting. Hunt wild boar for upcoming festival. Town over needs large pig for roasting, offering 4 silver. We could do this, Tata said. Without Tim, his special abilities don't work in the real world, remember? He said his dungeon lord powers only activate inside dungeons. Out here, he's just a skilled fighter. We can handle a boar hunt ourselves. Sarah considered. They had the equipment, the skills, and honestly, it would be nice to do something on their own for once. All right, she agreed. Let's do it. The hunt. They changed into their hunting attire, leather armor, weapons, supplies, mounted their horses, and rode out of town. The boar they found wasn't a simple pot-belly pig, it was a tusker. 7 feet long, 400 pounds, with tusks like curved daggers and a mean temperament. The fight was brutal, but exhilarating. Sarah took point, drawing its charges while Tata struck from the flanks. They worked together with the coordination built over 1,000 floors of dungeon delving, and after an hour of careful combat, the tusker fell. They hauled it back to town on a reinforced cart, arriving at the guild as the sun set. 4 silver, the clerk said, counting out 2 coins for each of them. Well done. Sarah looked at the coins in her palm. It's funny. This doesn't even help us. We have so much money already. Tata smiled. You're right. Beyond what I have in the pouch Tim gave me, my personal coffers have close to 3 million large gold coins. I could live like a queen for the rest of my life if I wanted. Sarah gasped. 3 million? I'm 347 years old, Sarah. I've had time to accumulate wealth. Tata paused. How much do you have? The king gave me 2 million when I was ennobled. I've barely touched it. Maybe converted 50,000 to small gold coins to pay the people running my estate. That's still enough to pay them for several years. They were laughing about the absurdity of doing a 4 silver quest when they had millions in the bank when one of the clerks handed Sarah a note. This came by messenger pigeon, marked urgent. Sarah opened it. Her expression changed immediately. I need to find Tim. He's probably still on his quests. Now, this is urgent. They split up, riding through town, checking the quest locations. Finally, they found him at a dessert cafe called the Sweet Ring, eating something fried with a hole in the middle. He had a pile of maybe 15 in front of him, along with dipping sauces, chocolate and white icing. He was drinking something dark and aromatic that smelled like heaven. Honey, Sarah said, entering the cafe with Tata. We need to talk. Tim looked up, a piece of fried dough in his mouth, powdered sugar on his nose. Sarah couldn't help it. She burst out laughing. You look ridiculous. They sat down, and Sarah handed him the note. Tim read it. His expression grew serious. We leave tomorrow, he said quietly. For where? The capital. The king has summoned us. Tim looked at both of them. Can I sleep in the bed tonight? Sarah and Tata exchanged glances, then smiled. Yes, honey, Tata said. You can. Tim clapped his hands. Men entered the cafe, each holding elaborate bouquets of exotic flowers. They presented them to Sarah and Tata with formal bows. Another man brought boxes, Garbina chocolates, printed on the lids in elegant script. Elven specialty candy, rare and expensive. The girls gasped. Okay, Sarah said, smelling the flowers. You're off the hook. Tim smiled, genuine relief flooding his features. Maybe this is how I get out of trouble from now on, he thought. He finished his pastries and his coffee while the girls examined their gifts, and for the first time since he'd said, "You look nice," Tim felt like he might actually survive being married to 2 women. Barely. But maybe. Chapter 9. The Gift That Would Change Tim's Life. The next morning, they rose before dawn. Tim moved through the inn room with quiet efficiency, packing supplies into their bottomless bags. Sarah and Tata followed his lead, asking no questions, sensing the tension radiating from him like heat from a forge. They mounted their horses and rode out of Crehen as the sun broke over the horizon. 2 hours out of town, Tim pulled pastries from his bag, the same fried dough from the Sweet Ring Cafe, still somehow fresh and warm, and handed one to each of the girls. "Eat this," he said. "It's breakfast. We can stop and eat properly," Sarah said. "No, we have to keep moving. We need to get there as soon as possible." "Why? What's wrong?" "I'll tell you later. I don't want to discuss it while on horseback." Tim's jaw was tight. "But it's urgent, and I'm a little pissed off at what I read." "Tim, slavery exists in this country," he said flatly, "and I won't allow Tony's legacy to be ruined by it." Sarah and Tata exchanged glances. Something was very wrong. They rode in silence after that, pushing the horses hard. They slept only every 3rd day, taking turns keeping watch while the others rested for a few hours. The journey that should have taken 2 weeks took 6 days. The capital Plar. They arrived dust-covered and exhausted, riding through the city gates without stopping. Guards recognized their duchy seals and waved them through immediately. They went straight to the palace. The antechamber was the same as Tim remembered. Marble floors, high ceilings, the weight of power pressing down like a physical thing. They waited for 20 minutes before being summoned. The throne room had changed. King Aldrich was gone. In his place sat a younger man, perhaps 30 years old, with the same strong jaw but kinder eyes. He wore the crown with visible discomfort, as though it weighed more than gold should. "Duke Willett," the young king said, rising. "My father died while you were gone. I'm glad to see you're still alive." Tim bowed. "Your Majesty, I'm sorry for your loss. I am Prince Caspian, well, King Caspian now, though the coronation ceremony is in 2 weeks. I wish you to be here for that day." He gestured to a chair. "You mentioned in your letter that you had concerns about slavery?" "Yes, Your Majesty. I've been thinking about it myself. My father barely did anything to the noble who assaulted your friend, Lady Sarah, I believe, the night of your ennoblement celebration." Caspian's expression hardened. "I decided to do something more permanent." He clapped his hands. Guards opened a side door, and people filed in. 7 of them, a man, a woman, 4 younger adults, and 1 child. All wore black bands around their necks. Tim's blood went cold. He recognized the older man immediately. Edmund Ashfern, Tony's father. The family that had disowned Tony for being magicless. The family that had humiliated him in public. The family that, Tim suspected but couldn't prove, had killed him to prevent the shame of having a son outrank them. And they were wearing slave collars. "I'm putting them under your household," Caspian said. "You own them as of today. Do with them as you will or wish. I'm also putting all of their land and property under your title. You own that as well. Additionally, I'm giving you the Badlands and the undeveloped plains behind their former estate. Maybe you can do something with it that no one else has been able to do for the last 300 years. Tim processed this slowly. More land, more responsibility, and 7 people who were now legally his property. People as property. His stomach turned. "Thank you, Your Majesty," he said carefully. "This is generous." "It's justice," Caspian said. "They harmed one of your wives and contributed to the death of a count. They deserve punishment." Tim wanted to argue, wanted to say that slavery was barbaric, that people couldn't be owned, that this was wrong on every fundamental level. But he was standing before a king, a new king, still finding his footing, who'd just done something he clearly thought was a favor. Tim bowed his head. "I accept your gift, Your Majesty, and I request permission to take them to my estate immediately. I'll need time to arrange things." "Of course," Caspian smiled. "Take as long as you need. And Duke Willett, I look forward to seeing you at the coronation." Tim turned to Sarah and Tata. "Please take them outside and arrange a carriage to take us to our estate. We'll be staying in town for at least a few months while I get things sorted." The girls ushered the Ashfern family out of the throne room, Tim remained behind, waiting until the doors closed. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, "congratulations on becoming king, and my condolences on your father's passing. He was a great king. I hope you can become even better." Caspian's expression softened. "Thank you. I plan to be. I want to be the best king this country has ever seen. With your upbringing, I know you will. Your mother was a great teacher, and she taught you well." The queen, still alive, still sitting on her smaller throne beside the empty king's seat, nodded to Tim. "Thank you for your kind words, Duke Willett." Tim bowed to both of them and left. Outside the palace, the Ashford family stood in a tight cluster near the carriages, looking lost and terrified. The black collars around their necks seemed to pulse with dark magic, not painfully, but as a constant reminder of their status. Tim approached Edmund slowly. The old man's hair had gone completely white since Tim last saw him. He looked frail, diminished, like someone who'd aged a decade in 3 years. "What did you do," Tim asked quietly, "to get your family put in this situation?" Edmund swallowed hard. "That night, at the noble gathering, I grabbed Lady Sarah's arm, insulted my son in public, refused to acknowledge his ennoblement." He paused. "The original king let it go, said I didn't understand what was happening, but when Prince Caspian took control and started the process of becoming king, the first thing he did was change that ruling. Made us slaves, your slaves." He dropped to his knees. "I hope we can live up to whatever you want us to do. Please don't kill my family. I beg of you. I was only trying to be a good baron. I had no idea how big of a mistake I was making. I let power get the best of me, and by the time I realized I had no real power to begin with, it was too late." Tim looked down at the man who'd broken Tony's spirit, who'd called his own son trash, who'd cast him out for the crime of being born without magic. He wanted to feel satisfaction, wanted to feel like justice had been served. Instead, he just felt tired. "I will not harm your family," Tim said, "but you will learn a new lifestyle for a while. And if things work out, if you do your best, maybe members of your family will become nobles again one day. As for you," he paused, "you might die before that day comes. I hope you understand that." "Yes." Edmund's voice was barely a whisper. "I do. I'm an old man. I don't expect to outlive many more years." "The carriage is ready," Tata called out. "And we got a wagon to carry them. I didn't want them to walk the whole way and be exhausted when we arrive." "Good thinking," Tim said. He turned to the Ashford family. "Step into the wagon, we're leaving." The estate, the trip took 8 hours. They arrived at Tim's duchy estate as the sun set, painting the manor in shades of gold and red. The staff, what little remained after most had quit when Tim renounced his title, emerged to greet them. James, the elderly butler, took one look at the wagon full of people wearing slave collars and his expression tightened. "My lord," he said carefully, "shall I prepare the guest quarters?" "The southwest wing," Tim said. "They'll be living there for the foreseeable future." "As you wish, my lord." Tim followed James inside while Sarah and Tata helped the Ashford family from the wagon. "I need you to teach them," Tim said quietly. "Everything they need to know about being maids and butlers for this household. I'm going to teach some of them professions as well." James studied him. "Are you going to keep them as slaves?" "Not for very long. I don't agree with slavery, but I have to keep them this way long enough to please the king, at least until after his coronation. Then I'll approach him about giving them a chance at life outside slavery, working for my family as honest commoners." Tim paused. "Maybe that will please him enough that I can free them." "It's not something I feel is right," he continued. "People should not own people. If I could change it throughout the entire kingdom, I would. But it's been tradition that those who do wrong should suffer punishment, and in this kingdom, punishment usually means slavery or becoming a gladiator. Neither profession I agree with." "I understand the punishment should match the severity of the crime," Tim said, "but this is too much." James nodded slowly. "I'll teach them, my lord, and I'll keep your confidence." "Thank you. Prepare something to eat for them. Then bring me coffee if we have any. If not, tea. I'll be in the library." "Yes, my lord." The library. Tim didn't like the study. It was too cramped, too formal, too much like the office of a nobleman who spent all day signing documents and counting money. The library was different. Open. filled with books he could lose himself in when the weight of responsibility became too much. He sat at a large oak table, pulled out the letter from Caspian, and read it again. Duke Willett, my father has passed. I am assuming the throne. As my first act, I am correcting an injustice done to your household. The Ashfern family, who insulted your wife and disrespected the memory of Count Anthony Ashfern, have been sentenced to slavery and placed under your ownership. Additionally, all Ashfern lands and properties now belong to your duchy. I am also granting you the Badlands and undeveloped plains, territory that has resisted cultivation for 3 centuries. Perhaps you will succeed where others have failed. I request your presence at my coronation in 2 weeks. King Caspian Theron IV. Tim set down the letter and rubbed his face. He now owned the family that had destroyed Tony, owned them legally, completely, with the power to do whatever he wanted to them, and he hated it. 1 month later, the Ashfern family adapted surprisingly well. Edmund's wife, a woman named Marjorie, who'd barely spoken the first week, turned out to be an excellent cook. Their oldest son, Marcus, had a talent for gardening. The daughters helped with cleaning and laundry. Even the youngest, a boy of 12 named Peter, found purpose running messages between the estate buildings. James taught them patiently, never mentioning their former status as nobles, treating them simply as new staff learning their roles. Tim watched from a distance, trying to decide what to do. He couldn't free them yet. Caspian had just become king, and contradicting his first major decree would be politically disastrous. But he could treat them well. Pay them small wages that technically went into an account for when they were freed. Give them decent quarters, good food, reasonable hours. Make slavery as humane as possible while working toward its end. Edmund approached him one evening in the library. "My lord," he said quietly, "may I speak freely?" Tim looked up from his book. "Yes. You're unlike any noble I've ever met. You treat us with kindness, with respect, even after—" He stopped, struggling for words. "Even after what I did to your friend, to my son." Tim set down his book. "What you did was wrong, cruel, unforgivable in many ways, I know. But I also know that people can change, can learn, can become better than they were." Tim paused. "I don't believe in slavery. I think it's barbaric. But since I'm stuck with you, I'm going to give you a choice. Learn to be better people or remain exactly what you are now. The choice is yours." Edmund bowed his head. "Thank you, my lord. I'll do my best. We all will." He left the library, and Tim returned to his book. But he couldn't concentrate. His thoughts kept drifting to Tony. Kind, formal, careful Tony, who'd been born into this family and rejected for being different. What Edmund didn't know, what Tim suspected but couldn't prove, was that Tony's death hadn't been the king's doing. It had been family. Edmund or one of his other children, unable to bear the shame of Tony outranking them, had arranged his death. Made it look natural, covered their tracks. Tim had no evidence, just instinct. The same instinct that let him see through dungeon traps and read monster patterns. And if he was right, Edmund would die never knowing that Tim knew the truth. Would die believing he'd merely been cruel to his son, not that he'd killed him. Tim closed his book and stared out the window at the darkening estate. Justice, he thought, was a complicated thing, and slavery made it even more complicated. He'd free them eventually, when the time was right. When Caspian was secure enough on the throne to accept the request. Until then, he'd treat them as well as he could. And hope that was enough. Chapter 10. Sarah says goodbye for the last time. 12 years later, Tim stood on the balcony of his estate and watched the sun set over lands he'd governed for more than a decade. He was 160 years old now, still appearing no older than 40, his dungeon lord nature keeping him young while the world aged around him. He'd lived through so much, changed so much. The slavery system still existed in the kingdom, but Tim had found a way to fight it from within. He used his considerable wealth to purchase slaves, people convicted of crimes, people sold by desperate families, people trapped in circumstances they couldn't escape, and gave them something no other master offered: hope. He taught them skills, carpentry, cooking, reading, accounting. He paid them small wages that accumulated over the years. And after 20 years of service, he approached the king, first Caspian, then his son, now his grandson, and requested their release. "These people have paid for their crimes," he'd say. I ask permission to release them as commoners with the condition that they work for my house for an additional 10 years before going their own way. Give them time to build enough money to support themselves in the real world. Every king had granted his requests. Over the past 12 years, Tim had freed 43 people. 43 former slaves who now lived as commoners, worked honest jobs, built families, and remembered the Duke who'd given them a second chance. Sarah had loved that idea. Loved that he was taking broken people and finding ways to fix them. 48 years earlier, Sarah had been 60 years old when they finally achieved true intimacy. They'd tried for years, awkward attempts, uncomfortable moments, false starts that left them both frustrated. But slowly, carefully, they'd learned each other. Learned how to be husband and wife instead of just friends forced into marriage. The night it finally worked, Sarah had wept with relief and joy. "I love you," she'd whispered. "I've loved you for so long, and I didn't know how to say it." "I love you too," Tim had replied, holding her close. "I'm sorry it took me so long to understand." They'd tried for children after that, desperately wanted them, but Sarah's body, damaged by years of dungeon delving and the magical examination that had declared Tony sterile, couldn't bear children. Tim and Sarah never had offspring together. But they had each other. And for a time, that was enough. The dungeons and labyrinths. Throughout the years, Tim had married 7 more dungeons, each one he'd completed, respected, and claimed according to dungeon law. They became his wives in the way dungeons understood marriage. Eternal bonds that transcended physical form, connections that let him access their floors freely and share their accumulated knowledge. Hollow Roots remained his favorite, his first. The one who'd challenged him after 3 years away and reminded him what he was meant to be. But there was one labyrinth that stood out among all the others. Otitis. Female. Built from anger. She'd formed from the ruins of Necropolis 40 years ago, rising from rage and grief over what she believed was the death of a brother labyrinth at Tim's hands. "I didn't kill Necropolis," Tim had told her when they first met. "The All-Cube did, the Lord of Dungeons. Your own kind collapsed it in on itself for breaking dungeon law, for parasitizing a child core." Otitis hadn't believed him at first. But over time, as Tim delved her floors carefully, respectfully, never taking more than necessary, she'd come to understand the truth, and she'd chosen to live. Tim had never killed a labyrinth of death before. The guildmaster, the one who'd known Jeffrey, had warned him not to. And Otitis proved why. She became an ally, a friend, eventually something like family. The area where Necropolis had stood remained vacant for 40 years, until Sarah died. Sarah's death. She'd been 120 years old, still sharp, still witty, still beautiful to Tim, despite the gray hair and lined face that marked her as elderly by human standards. But her body was failing. Decades of dungeon delving had taken their toll. Her heart was weak, her lungs struggled. The healers said she had perhaps a month. Sarah faced death with the same pragmatic courage she'd faced dungeons. "I want to be buried where Necropolis used to stand," she said one evening, holding Tim's hand. "Where we ran that day, where you saved us, I want to rest there." "Sarah, promise me, Tim." "That's where I want to be," he promised. The funeral. It was a small affair. Tata stood beside Tim, tears streaming down her face. James, impossibly still alive at 103 years old, wept openly. The freed slaves Tim had helped over the years attended, hundreds of them, forming a silent honor guard. They buried Sarah in the clearing where Necropolis had once stood. Tim said his final goodbye, placed a hand on the earth covering her grave, and wept for the first time in decades. "I love you," he whispered. "I'll always love you. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for being patient with me. Thank you for being my wife." He stayed there until sunset, then walked away, Tata supporting him. Behind them, unnoticed, the earth began to glow. The transformation. The god of labyrinths and dungeons, the All-Cube, the ancient power that governed all dungeonkind, watched Sarah's soul. She'd been the wife of a dungeon lord, had delved 1,000 floors, had lived with courage and love and fierce determination. She deserved more than simple death. The All-Cube reached out, gathered her soul before it could pass beyond, and offered a gift. "Become what your husband protects, live in a form he understands, be with him forever in the way his kind allows." Sarah's soul, confused and afraid, nevertheless accepted, and where her grave had been, A dungeon entrance began to form. 110 years later. Tim woke in his bed. He was 160 now, still sharing a room with Tata, who looked perhaps 30 despite being 457 years old. He kissed her forehead, started to rise and froze. A voice, familiar. Beloved. Tim? Can you hear me? Sarah? He whispered. I'm here. I don't understand what happened, but I'm here. Tim was out of bed and running before Tata could ask what was wrong. He didn't bother with horses, just ran, following the voice through his mental connection to dungeons. He reached the clearing where he'd buried Sarah and stopped. A dungeon entrance stood there, new, fresh, carved from white stone instead of the dark rock most dungeons favored. Tim, I'm so confused. What am I? You're a dungeon, Tim said, approaching slowly. Sarah, you're a dungeon. How? I died. I remember dying. The All-Cube transformed you, gave you a second chance. Tim touched the entrance. Can I come in? Yes. Please. I need to see you. Tim stepped through. The dungeon was unlike any he'd ever entered. The walls were warm stone, lit by soft golden light. Flowers grew in impossible places, climbing the walls, sprouting from the floor, filling the air with familiar scents. Sarah's favorite flowers from their estate garden. There were no monsters, no traps, just open corridors leading deeper. Tim walked for hours, descending floor after floor until he reached the core chamber. It was a room of crystal and light, and in the center, Sarah's core. It was smaller than most, perhaps 3 feet in diameter, and it pulsed with warm pink gold light that reminded Tim of sunrise. I'm here, Sarah's voice said. I'm really here. Tim approached the core and wrapped his arms around it, hugging it the way he'd hugged hollow roots so long ago. The core was warm, alive, and when he kissed it, a soft press of lips against smooth crystal, he felt Sarah kiss him back in the way dungeons could. I'm so sorry, he whispered. I should have had more time with you. We should have had more years. We have time now, forever, if the stories Hollow Roots tells me are true. Dungeon lords live for 900 years, and dungeons live until they're destroyed. We could have centuries together. Tim laughed through his tears. You're okay with being a dungeon? I'm okay with being with you, whatever form that takes. They stayed like that for hours, Tim holding Sarah's core, talking about everything and nothing, relearning each other in this strange new form. 40 years later, Sarah learned quickly. She spoke with other dungeons through the network, learned their history, their laws, their understanding of what dungeon lords were and what they meant. She created floors, monsters, treasures, became a fully functioning dungeon that adventurers began to delve. She was known as Sarah Willett, the Dungeon of Light. Stories spread of a dungeon that never killed adventurers who showed respect, but gave generous rewards to those who completed her challenges with honor. Tim visited often, sometimes alone, sometimes with Tata. They'd walk her halls, speak with her core, share their lives. It was peaceful. Until a man named Vordak, a C-rank adventurer with delusions of grandeur, attempted to destroy Sarah's core. He made it to the core chamber through sheer luck and treachery, sacrificing his entire party to bypass her defenses. And when he raised his weapon to strike her core, Sarah, terrified, furious, desperate to survive, transformed. The dungeon shook, the walls cracked, reality itself seemed to bend, and Sarah became a labyrinth. The labyrinth of light and shadow. Tim felt the transformation through their bond. He was in his estate, meeting with freed slaves about their upcoming releases, when pain lanced through his skull so intense he collapsed. Sarah, he screamed. Tata was beside him instantly. What's wrong? She's transforming. She's becoming a labyrinth. Is that bad? I don't know. He ran again, ran like he had 110 years ago, following the bond to the clearing. The entrance had changed. What had been white stone was now mixed, white and black, light and shadow, beautiful and terrible. Tim stepped through. The labyrinth was chaos. Sarah's floors had expanded, multiplied. What had been perhaps 50 floors was now hundreds, possibly thousands. The monsters had changed. Beautiful creatures of light mixed with terrible shadows, neither fully good nor fully evil, but complex and dangerous. And Sarah's voice in his head was jumbled. Tim, is that you? I can't. Where am I? What happened? Tim, I'm scared. No, I'm angry. I'm everything. I can't think straight. Help me. Don't help me. Leave. Stay. Kill him. No, I didn't mean Tim. He tried to reach her core, but the labyrinth fought him. Not intentionally. Sarah didn't want to hurt him, but she was no longer fully in control. The transformation had fractured her consciousness, split her between the person she'd been and the labyrinth she'd become. Tim fought his way to the 100th floor before admitting defeat. He couldn't reach her. Not like this. Not while she was still transforming, still becoming. He stood in a chamber of light and shadow, tears streaming down his face, and made the hardest decision of his long life. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he whispered. "I can't kill you, I won't, but I can't save you either. Not yet. Maybe in time, you'll stabilize. Maybe you'll find yourself again, and when you do, I'll be waiting." He left the labyrinth, and behind him, Sarah's fractured consciousness wept. Present day. The labyrinth still stood. The kingdom had declared it off limits. No adventurers allowed. Too dangerous, too unpredictable. Tim visited the entrance sometimes, stood at the threshold, tried to speak with Sarah through their bond. Some days, she responded, lucid, herself. Other days, only chaos answered. He'd hung up his sword finally. Decided at 160 that he'd done enough, saved enough people, delved enough dungeons, married enough living labyrinths to understand their pain. Now he lived comfortably as a duke, using his wealth to free more slaves, teaching the next generation, prepare whatever came next. Tata remained with him. His first elven wife, patient and kind and eternal. And there was Cindy, a new wife he'd met just 5 years ago. Human, young, full of fire and questions and life. She'd help him write the next chapter of his story. But Sarah remained trapped in the labyrinth, caught between human and dungeon, love and rage, light and shadow. Tim stood on his balcony, watching the sunset, and thought about her. "One day," he said quietly, "one day I'll find a way to help you, to bring you back, or to give you peace, whichever you need." The wind carried no answer, but somewhere in a labyrinth of light and shadow, a fractured consciousness heard him. And remembered love. Epilogue. Dear reader, the journey of Tim Willett, the Dungeon Lord, has only just begun. You've witnessed his awakening, his struggles with nobility, his marriages to dungeons and people alike. You've seen him fight against systems of slavery and oppression, navigate the complexities of immortal life, and face the tragedy of outliving those he loves. But there is so much more to come. In future books, you'll learn about Cindy, the newest addition to Tim's unconventional family. You'll discover what becomes of the labyrinth of light and shadow. You'll see Tim face the hero dungeon that appears once every 5,000 years, the only dungeon capable of killing him. You'll witness the evolution of the kingdom, the changing laws, the slow death of slavery, and the birth of new systems. And you'll explore deeper mysteries. What is the All-Cube truly? Why do dungeon lords exist? What happens when gods make mistakes, and those mistakes refuse to die? This journey is far from over. It is merely the beginning. Thank you for walking this path with us, for caring about Tim, Sarah, Tata, and all the broken, beautiful people who populate this world. We can't wait to share what comes next. Until then, dear reader, take care. Your friends beyond the veil of understanding. The end of Book 1.